This is a headache that the US coalition certainly didn't really want to have. I mean, they're already dealing with, one could say, a much more serious strategic nightmare in that they're trying to prevent Turkey from unsuccessfully prevent Turkey from attacking the US-allied SDF and Kurdish opposition forces that have been fighting Assad and Daesh. Turkey, of course, a NATO ally. So in the north of Syria, the northeast of Syria, you have a situation where the Americans are, in the case of special forces and airstrikes, staring down barrel to barrel a NATO ally. And now in the southeast, they've had to take kinetic action against the Syrian regime, which marks certainly an escalation of the limited flashpoints that they've had. The US-led coalition very much trying to stay out of the Syrian civil war while prosecuting Daesh strongholds in Syria. Clearly a difficult balancing act, and only going to get more difficult as the pockets of Daesh resistance get smaller and smaller.
A difficult balancing act, but is it also, you were just mentioning, that attack by Turkish forces on a Kurdish-held enclave near the border in northern Syria? The president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who's been threatening to move on Manbij, where U.S. forces are present. These attacks against the Syrian government forces also sends a signal to Ankara?
Potentially. I mean, this is something that the US, in particular, as part of the coalition, has been very clear to signal at every turn that while it's keeping the presence of its ground teams, special forces advisory units in Syria quite low key, that when they are threatened, almost whoever that might be by, kinetic action is taken. So we saw the shoot-down of a Syrian UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle, and then more recently the shoot-down and killing of the pilot of a Syrian attack jet after it dropped bombs near positions occupied by American advisors training the SDF. So again, this is clearly on a much larger scale. These strikes on what appears to be a small Syrian offensive operation. But it's part of a long-term strategy that while the ground aims of US advisors are quite restrained in relation to the much more clear objectives in Iraq, that kinetic action will be taken if US advisors or other coalition SF take fire. So that's clearly very difficult where Ankara is involved because NATO partner, NATO ally.
You know, Justin Bronk, the week began with us asking if Russia wasn't getting bogged down in Syria after one of their planes were shot down in Idlib province. Can we ask the same thing now about the Americans after this airstrike?
To a certain extent. I mean, the Americans are in arguably a more difficult political position because they're caught between these competing alliances. They don't want to be seen to abandon the Kurds, who've been by far their most reliable allies in the fight against Daesh, particularly in the early stages. And they don't want to abandon the Syrian democratic forces, the sort of remains of the popular uprising, the democratic uprising against Assad at the beginning of the civil war, who have also been helping to fight Daesh. But at the same time, they have no plan for a desired end state in Syria vis-à-vis the Syrian civil war. So, and the Turks refuse to see what the US would like to see, which is a sort of reasonably strong, self-defense capable Kurdish region, as at least a pocket of stability in Syria. So they're bogged down politically. Russia, on the other hand, has kind of staked a lot on a much larger strategic level on being a sort of peace broker, a power broker who has spent a lot of money, certainly in some lives, changing the situation on the ground in Syria in Assad's favour in order to keep their strategic bases at Tartus and Latakia, as well as be seen as a defender of regimes that the West wants to overthrow. The problem with doing that is they're definitely bogged down because by keeping that and by winning and then keeping that military presence in the region and staking themselves as an ally and a sort of peace broker around Assad, they're then tied to whatever end state he creates in the civil war. So they're probably more bogged down in the situation, albeit the Americans are more politically uncomfortable for the moment.
And just one final question for you, Justin. The Kurds certainly must feel bolstered by this.
To a certain degree, yes. at the same time, it's far from clear that the US would be willing to actually strike Turkish units.
Yeah, because were they there to defend the Kurds on the ground, or their own military advisors who were with them?
Well, there have been plenty of clashes previously between Syrian government forces and the SDF. I mean, we're just hearing about Ghouta. This is not an isolated thing, and the US has not struck Syrian government forces before, except when there has been a kinetic threat to Western special forces advisors on the ground. So it would seem that is why there was such a strong impact here. And it is worth remembering, of course, that the SDF is not particularly Kurdish or Arab. There's a mix of different ethnicities there. It's not nearly such a kind of ethnically defined group as the Kurds within eastern Syria as a whole, which Turkey has a problem with. Turkey doesn't really have a problem with the SDF in anything like the same sense. So the Kurds might feel bolstered in the sense that the US is clearly stating that it does have red lines vis-à-vis its forces in Syria, and there are SF in and around the Kurdish forces too, as we've been hearing. In the northeast, facing the Turks, the US have been quite clear that they have advisors there and they're not prepared to see them harmed. But in terms of kinetic strikes of this sort against Turkish forces, it's really hard to see that happening.
Justin Bronk of the Royal United Services Institute, many thanks for joining us from London.